Think about a communication problem that your organization has already fixed. Maybe it was a handoff issue, or unclear ownership, or a decision that never quite reached everyone who needed it. So the team adjusted. Someone created a workaround, people figured out how to keep things moving. So eventually, the problem stopped looking like a problem. But what if it never actually went away? What if the organization is paying for it somewhere else? That's the idea behind communication debt. Welcome to Invisible Until It's Expensive, where we examine the communication problems healthcare organizations often don't see until they become operational problems. I'm Devon Bruce, founder and CEO of the ECA Institute. And over the years, I have spent a lot of time thinking about what happens after a communication problem occurs. I'm going to start sharing my screen because organizations are actually pretty good at keeping things moving. Someone fills in the gap, a manager steps in, or a team creates a workaround. People literally learn who they need to ask and what they need to double check, or what parts of the process doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. And from the outside, that can look like the problem has been solved, but I began to notice something. Sometimes the communication problem wasn't actually resolved. People had simply learned how to work around it. And there's an important difference between those two things. Because when a team finds a way to keep the work moving, it can create the appearance of resolution because the immediate disruption is gone, the task gets completed, the patient, they get what they need, and everyone just moves on to the next thing. But underneath that apparent resolution, people may still be compensating for that original problem. Someone knows they always have to double check a particular piece of information, or someone else knows who to call because the documented process isn't quite enough, or a manager, they step in whenever ownership becomes unclear. None of those things necessarily look like major communication problems on their own. And in fact, they can actually make the organization looks like it's functioning just fine. But the work continuing and the problem being solved are not necessarily the same thing. And when that happens repeatedly, the original communication problem can become harder and harder to see while its consequences continue to build. So I needed language for that pattern, because if we only look at the pattern we can see today, we may miss everything that happened before it. For example, the unanswered question, the unclear decision, the conversation that was postponed, the workaround everyone eventually learned to live with. Individually, like I said, those moments may seem very small. Some might not even feel significant enough to even address at that time. But unresolved doesn't necessarily mean gone. And when those problems begin to accumulate, the organization can continue carrying those effects long after the original conversation has been forgotten. That's the pattern I began calling communication debt. At the ECA Institute, we define communication debt this way. Communication debt happens when unresolved communication problems quietly accumulate until they become operational problems. Now, there are three parts of that definition I want you to pay attention to: unresolved, accumulate, and operational problems, because those three ideas are what help us understand the difference between ordinary communication problem and something an organization may continue carrying. Let's start with unresolved. When I use that word, I don't necessarily mean that nobody noticed the problem or that nobody tried to address it, because quite often something was done, right? A manager clarified the issue in the moment, or someone filled in missing information, the team created the workaround, maybe a new reminder was added to the process. The immediate problem may even have stopped disrupting the work. But there's a difference between responding to a communication problem and resolving what allowed that problem to persist. Because think about clear ownership. Two people aren't sure who's responsible for a particular follow-up, so one of them takes care of it. And at the end of the day, things get done. The patients get what they need, the task is completed, and from an operational standpoint, everything seems to appear fine. But if the underlying ownership is still unclear, the next person who encounters that same situation has to figure it out all over again. That's what I want you to notice. An unresolved communication problem can exist inside an organization that appears to be functioning very well. Sometimes the reason we don't see the problem is because people have become so good at compensating for it. And that brings us to the second part of the definition, which is accumulate. One resolved communication problem may not seem particularly significant. Some of that looks like someone asking an extra question, or maybe a decision takes a little longer, or maybe two people walk away from a meeting with slightly different interpretations of what happens next. And when you think about those individually, each of those moments can feel very small. But organizations don't experience communication one moment at a time. They experience these moments across teams, across departments, shifts, and across decisions. And when that underlying problem isn't resolved, some of that friction can carry forward. The way that looks, the next conversation begins with a little less clarity, or the next handoff requires a little bit more checking. The next decision takes a little bit more effort because people aren't quite working from the same understanding. No single moment necessarily creates communication debt on its own. It's the accumulation part that matters. Because think of it like carrying a small weight. One may barely register, but if you keep adding weight without putting any of it down, and eventually you're carrying something very different from what you started with. That's where the word debt is meant to help us see, because the organization may keep moving, but it can also keep carrying unresolved communication forward with it. And eventually, what that organization is carrying may start to show up somewhere else. That's the third part of the definition, which is operational problems. This is where communication debt can become difficult to recognize because the consequence doesn't always look like the communication problem that created it. Imagine a decision is made, but the expectations around that decision aren't completely clear. And when that happens, if you think about it, nothing dramatic really happens. People interpret the decision slightly differently and they continue working. But then later, one team executes it one way, and then another team executes it differently. Someone notices the inconsistency and starts asking for clarification, and then work has to be revisited. A manager gets pulled in. And by that point, what does the organization see? It may see a delay. It might see rework, inconsistent execution. But those are the problems that are showing up now. The communication history that may contributed to them may have started much earlier. And that is one of the most important ideas behind communication debt. Where a problem appears isn't necessarily where it began. If we only address the visible operational problem, we may never examine the unresolved communication sitting upstream from it. And that can leave an organization solving the same kinds of problems again and again without understanding why they keep returning. And this is why naming the problem matters, because without a way to describe this pattern, it's so easy to look at each consequence as a separate event. A delayed decision is treated as a delayed decision. Rework is treated as a process problem, or an unclear handoff is addressed in that very moment. A reoccurring misunderstanding becomes another conversation that needs to happen. And sometimes that's exactly where things are, because not every communication problem is communication debt. But when problems remain unresolved, when people repeatedly compensate for them, and when the consequences continue to build, looking at each incident in isolation can keep us from seeing the larger pattern. Communication debt gives us language to ask a different question. Instead of asking, what went wrong this time? We can also ask, does this problem have a larger communication history? Now, that doesn't mean we assume communication is the cause of every operational problem. It just means we become willing to look upstream when familiar problems keep returning. And once we have language for something that was previously difficult to see, we can begin to recognize it. So as you think about your own organization, I don't want you to leave this conversation looking for communication debt everywhere. I want you to start by noticing. So think about a problem your team has addressed more than once. Maybe it's a handoff that continues to require clarification or a decision that keeps getting interpreted differently. A responsibility that seems clear on paper, but becomes less clear when the work actually happens. Or maybe it's a process that largely works because certain people know how to fill in the gaps. When you start noticing those things, then ask yourself, has this problem actually been resolved? Or have we simply become better at working around it? And if it keeps returning, ask one more question. What communication history might be sitting underneath it? Now, you don't need to diagnose the problem yet, and you don't need to fix everything or anything based on this one question alone. But for now, the goal is to simply notice the possibility that some of the operational problems we see today may have started much earlier than we realize. That's the lens communication debt gives us, because communication problems, they don't always disappear. Sometimes they accumulate. And sometimes what looks like a new operational problem is carrying the history of an old communication problem with it. And that's where I want to leave you today. If you'd like to continue exploring communication debt, you'll find the ECA Institute's latest research, publications, and resources in the description below. And if this gave you a different way to think about a problem you're seeing in your organization, subscribe to Invisible Until It's Expensive. We'll continue examining communication debt and what it can mean for healthcare organizations. I'm Devon Bruce, founder and CEO of the ECA Institute. And remember, what looks like today's operational problem may have started with yesterday's unresolved communication.